Hi there, welcome to the exam review for the 2019 AQA A-Level Psychology paper. I'm going to be looking at paper 2 and also issues and debates from paper 3 in this video today. It's just worth pointing out that because the exam questions I'll be referring to are not in the public domain, I won't be using the exact wording of the questions when going through them. Teachers can download a copy of these questions from the AQA website, and once the exam paper is made public, I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. All right, let's get started. So here we go. These are just the three topics and then the issues and debates. For paper 2, you can just see there has been a decline in paper 2 performance. It's actually the same in paper 1. Paper 1 has seen a steady decline over the years. So we had 59% was the average mark in 2017, down to 54% in 2018, and then 52% in 2019. So I'll be delving into the paper 2 questions and also issue and debates just to hopefully give you some kind of insight as to what has made the 2019 performance the lowest that we've seen so far. Okie dokie, so the first section here is approaches. Now we had a 1 mark multiple choice question on the biological approach. There was a poor performance here with an average mark of 39%. Now this clearly demonstrates that students don't understand genotype and phenotype, which was what this question was actually on. Now there was a STEM question on genotype and phenotype back in 2017 that was also poorly answered. So this is certainly a red flag for students in terms of checking their understanding of both genotype and phenotype. There was a 1 mark multiple choice question on operant conditioning as well. Not too bad overall here. Errors do seem to be within the confusion though of what negative reinforcement means. Just remember, negative reinforcement is not the same as punishment. Punishment decreases the likelihood of behaviour, whereas negative reinforcement increases the likelihood of the behaviour. Then we had a 2 mark question on the role of the unconscious. Now, although the role of the unconscious is named on the specification, it does seem that students were really poorly prepared. Many just kind of waffled on about their go-to, what they knew about the psychodynamic approach, which seemed to be the role, the id, the ego, and the superego in terms of the structure of the personality, and that's not completely different area of the specification, but it is a different area within the psychodynamic approach specification. The next question was a big question. It was a 6 mark application question on mediational processes linking to a STEM. Students simply have to stop ignoring the STEM. We've seen it across paper 1 already in terms of the AO2 part of the application. They're just doing very poorly on it, or they're ignoring it altogether. So many students gave really detailed descriptions of what the mediational processes were and just simply neglected at all to link it to the STEM. And of course that's going to impact on the amount of marks that are available for those students. The next mediational processes questions was better. So again, application of knowledge for this one, but this time only for 2 marks. You just needed to make reference to the fact that you're more likely to identify with someone who's a high status role model and therefore buy the product. So pretty straightforward there in terms of that answer. Next we had a calculation of percentage increase from a set of data you'd be given. This was a real poor performance, and I wouldn't be surprised with percentage increase questions knowing that they've appeared on previous exam series and students have done poorly. I'm not surprised to see it again as a question, and indeed I wouldn't be surprised to see it again in the future. Now the next kind of reference to kind of SLT, we've got a lot of SLT on here, is again about mediational processes. It's a very straightforward STEM question for 1 mark where you basically just have to say use a female role model. On to Wundt. Okay, just remember Wundt is on the specification for approaches. Some people seem to have forgot that Wundt's there. So you had basically asked about Wundt and his contributions to BIOPSYCHOLOGY as a science for 8 marks, and a really poor performance across the board. Students were obviously just not prepared for this question at all. The AO1 on the whole wasn't actually too bad. What let students down was the evaluation. Now remember, this is an 8-mark question. There are 3 marks for AO1 and 5 for AO3. Students went on and on and on, wrote way more AO1 than they needed, and then very little AO3. Or the AO3 that they did write was really, really generic. Generic evaluation that wasn't really focused on the question. Some students also got a little bit confused in this question and started talking about the timeline of psychology, which obviously wasn't part of the question. Okay, now we're on to biopsych, and we start with a 1-mark multiple choice question on ways of studying the brain. Many students failed to select the correct answer for this question, which was supposed to be fMRI. The reason being, of course, that an fMRI has a better level of spatial resolution than other methods, so we'll be able to clearly see which area of the brain was active during the task. The fact that this is quite low in terms of performance would perhaps indicate to me as a teacher that students aren't great on understanding the reasoning behind using different methods of studying the brain, something certainly worth looking into. Then the next one was a diagram question with a series of questions attached to it about types of neuron. So we started with the type of neuron that we'd only see in the brain's visual system or spinal cord, which would be the relay neuron. Then you had a question on which of these carries impulses from the brain to muscles. That would be motor neuron. And then you had a question on which carries impulses between neurons, which would be relay neuron again. And I think this was a little bit naughty from AQA personally. Started with 3 diagrams, relay, sensory and motor, but students didn't seem to be aware of the fact that they could use each letter more than once here, which may be the reasoning behind the low performance of students on this question. So certainly something to think about in the future there. That is a little bit tricky, a little bit misleading in my opinion. Next was a question on the function of the endocrine system. Now, gosh, students really need to read questions closely. It did say very, very clearly in this question, do not refer to the adrenal gland and adrenaline as your answer. And lo and behold, most students ignored that, giving really, really details of the role of adrenaline and the adrenal gland, etc. All that was required in this question was really straightforward. It was to name a hormone, where it was produced, its effect, and a general statement about the function of the endocrine system. The key takeaway here is basically read the questions. There are plenty of hormones for you to choose from. Testosterone, very, very straightforward. Melatonin, really, really nice links into later on biopsych. But like I said, students just failed to read this question, which is a bit of a shame because it was pretty straightforward. Right. Biopsych finishes off with this lovely 16-mark STEM question, and I'm sure every student and teacher was absolutely thrilled with this. It kind of answers the question, can we get a 16-marker in biopsych? The answer is yes. Now the average mark here is around 8. Very few students were able to access higher mark bands on this question, and again, like I've said before with the STEM questions, you have to engage with the STEM. It was a complete lack of engagement with the STEM. In addition, this question showed, like the multi-storm model of memory question, the 16 marker on paper 1 this year, real poor in terms of organisation. This was a very, very complex question. What students should have done is just take a moment to plan out how they were going to approach this question. For example, are you going to focus on hemispheric lateralization or localization of function? Because really the only way to approach this answer is to focus on one of them. There's so much confusion when you try to bin both into them. That being said, the evaluation on this as well was really poor. It basically seemed that anyone who had made reference to Sperry thought they could spend the majority of their time just given an evaluation of Sperry for this question, which of course resulted in really, really low banded marks in terms of their evaluation there. Okay, now everybody's favourite, research methods. Okay, so obviously this section's huge, so I'll try to concentrate on the kind of lower performing questions here. I'll focus in just to start on that second one, which is the MCQ in terms of the role of peer review. This is a really important learning curve for students. Just to highlight the fact, the role of peer review isn't to ensure only significant results are published, and this is a really common misconception among students. It's just as important to have non-significant results published in journals because it tells us what we need to look at basically. Just move down to the STEM question there in terms of writing a hypothesis. This was for 3 marks, and we've seen these kinds of questions in previous exam series, and students struggled on those too. The key takeaway is that hypothesis needs to have operationalised EVs and IVs. So don't just say condition 1, condition 2. And also because this is a STEM question, it must be it was related to the previous question that asked you what type of hypothesis would be used. You had to have written either a non-directional hypothesis, or you could have got away with actually writing a null hypothesis. The next question asks students to identify and evaluate sampling method. This has been a bit of confusion for students. Many students were confusing the opportunity sampling with volunteer or random sampling, and the big problem was that even if they'd identified the correct method, they basically gave a largely generic evaluation that wasn't given the context related to the STEM at all. Next, students were asked how to match participants in a matched pairs design for the STEM, and this was for 4 marks. So it's useful to think, if there's 4 marks, are there kind of 4 distinct things that I can say, one of which of course is going to be the variable that participants are being matched on. And it's worth thinking, when thinking about that variable, what your next steps would be related to that variable. For example, you might find it difficult to say too much if you just said gender in terms of the matched variable. But again, that's a really low performing question there, something that we can learn hopefully in the future in terms of answering those types of. Okay, so the rest of research methods. We have a couple of questions on the sign test. So the first one was a calculation question for 2 marks, and it's really clear from students' performance on this that a lot of them simply have no idea about how to calculate the sign test. So a lot of crazy answers, a lot of answers just left blank, lots of students incorrectly stating the higher of the 2 values to be asked. It's definitely worth revisiting the sign test, as judging by this year's performance, I'd expect to see it again really soon. Related to this, there was a next question, which is a STEM question following on from this, which then asked students to state whether the result is significant or not for 2 marks. Now, as this was related to the previous question, of course, students who'd left the previous question blank are also leaving this blank. Many of them stated that n was 10. They neglected to omit the equals values from m, which would make n 8. You know, and if students knew how to calculate the sign test, they'd be getting these questions right. Like I say, definitely worth going over the sign test. Next, we have a pretty abysmal question in terms of student performance for concurrent validity. Now, this is named on the specification, but students just seem to have zero idea about what it was, and many students just trying to kind of wing it in their answers. Most students seem to confuse it with test retest. Some split half, some talked about ecological validity. So it's definitely worth knowing. This is on the specification, and it's also worth flagging up, you know, face validity is also on the specification in terms of a method of assessing for validity. Certainly one to look at for next year's exam. Now, the STEM on internal validity questionnaire that's 100%, I've highlighted because, whoops-a-daisy, this was an invalid question. So AQA basically said, well, we're really sorry, internal validity isn't named on the specification. We shouldn't have asked a specific question on it. So at least we know that everybody got 4 marks in research methods regardless. Then we have a STEM question asking students to select the right test. I have to say the mark scheme was very generous here. It's obvious that students have very little understanding in terms of how to select the right test from a STEM. We saw a similar type question in paper 1. This is a huge red flag area. Selecting a test has been on every single examination series, 2017, 2018, 2019. You can pretty much categorically state it will be there again in terms of 2020 as well. All right, then we're on to the design a study question. So this was a 12-mark question asking students to design an experiment, and we've seen this before, so it's no surprise that it's here on this year's exam. We had a 1 in 2017 design a study question, and there's a low performance on this one all around, so around kind of like 5 marks for the average. Now, answering these questions is all about sticking to the bullet points that are provided. Lots and lots of students were providing real discussion about things that simply weren't needed. For example, lots of discussion about ethics. And it's really obvious as well that students didn't read the STEM closely. That's to say they didn't read the question closely, which asked them to explicitly design an independent groups experiment. Lots of students ignoring this and of course scoring no marks. There was a lot of students as well who simply kind of rehashed information from the previous STEM and of course scored them a grand total of 0 as well. Alrighty then, I said we just pick up issues and debates here, paper 3, because I'm not going to do a paper 3 video. Obviously with all of the topics in paper 3 it would take absolutely forever. So we'll just start on the bit of paper 3 that we know everyone's done, which is the issues and debates. Now the first question on issues and debates from paper 3 was a 2-marker on what socially sensitive research means. Students didn't really seem to get this question in terms of what it was asking to them. Many just referred to ethical issues. Better examples kind of used an example to illustrate what their explanation actually was on this one. Okay, now the next question on paradigm shifts was interesting. Students really struggled with this. What they needed to do is engage with the STEM they were given, and again, like we've seen before in STEM questions, so many students actually failed to do this. Paradigm shift is named on the research method specification. It does fall within a part of the specification that has pretty much been untouched now, so I wouldn't be surprised to see more from that bullet point in next year's examination. Next question was an MCQ on ethnocentrism. The most common mark, the modal mark, was 1 out of 2. This is a big red flag. We haven't heard a lot about cultural bias over the last 3 years, so this poor performance in a relatively straightforward MCQ question illustrates students have very, very poor understanding in this area, so definitely something we want to address. Okay, now the big one, a 16-mark question on the nature-nurture debate. It was pretty much a dead cert that this would appear this year. Huge gap there in terms of question, but the average mark really, really low. Now, the focus of student answers was poor. Many students spending a long time discussing the different approaches and detailing rather than detailing what the debate actually was. It's also worth considering how to approach the evaluation in these questions, bearing in mind that we're not really talking about strengths or weaknesses. What we're talking about is the implications and consequences. So maybe just students need to spend a bit of time kind of rewording their evaluations so they seem to flow better. Also, when students were drawing examples from their topics, which of course they're encouraged to do because it helps illustrate their knowledge, they must make sure that the examples that they're using are relevant and clearly linked to the debate. The idea is they've got to actually add something into the discussion. And let's remember, this is supposed to be a discussion. This is a debate between nature and nurture. There is a scale, you know, students had so much they could talk about in terms of the heritability coefficient, and students just largely ignored that. So really, really poor performance in this, a little bit disappointing. Okay, if you haven't already, check out the paper 1 exam review and come back soon when I'll be posting some predictions about the 2020 examinations. Thank you.